Hello from WEF in Davos, where the temperatures here are literally below freezing, but the spirits are incredibly high. And we're here today in the Facebook space to answer a really big question and a really important question. How do we make our businesses profitable whilst also making sure that we're having a positive impact on society? Can profit and purpose go together, or are they diametric opposites? Now, at Facebook, what we're doing is that we're trying to make the world better in a lot of different ways. And we're actually giving businesses the tools so that they can go out there and give them what they need to grow, but also to create jobs and, crucially, to support local economies. We help NGOs, we help community groups, and we help them tell their stories. We help them to fundraise, and we also make sure that they can connect people both on the online world, but also, importantly and increasingly, more and more in the real world as well. And we're also thinking a lot about diversity and inclusion, how we're building a workforce that reflects both the world outside, but also making sure that the tech we're creating can actually work across for different communities. So diversity and inclusion are very much topics that we're going to be talking about in a moment. So to kick us off, my view is that profit and purpose can sit very comfortably as bedfellows together. But to facilitate the wider conversation, I'm going to hand over to Krishna, who is a London-based lawyer. He's going to be our thought leader, and you're going to take us through today.
Thank you very much, Nicola. Thank you, and welcome to everyone watching home and everyone here in the room. Can I just say this is so exciting, particularly because usually conversations in Davos happen behind closed doors. They are secret, and there's a lot of mystery about what goes on, but here we are live across the world to millions of people. So first of all, that's exciting. And secondly, we're here to talk about something very, very important. And the other thing that I think is quite special about this panel is that we have a majority of women. And there's a lot of talk about how there aren't enough women at Davos, there aren't enough women on panels, but it's wonderful to see that. So to start us off, I'd like to introduce everyone on the panel. We've got Sarah Kate Ellis, who's the president and CEO of GLAD. We've got Jim Fitterling, the CEO of Dow. We've got Nicola, needs no introduction. We've got Dame Vivian Hunt, the managing partner for McKinsey UK and Ireland. And we've got Christiana Riley, CEO of Deutsche Bank USA. Thank you so much for giving up your time to be part of this conversation. We know that your time is at a premium, so let's just launch straight into it. Sure. The question really that I want us to address in this conversation is this idea of, it's a truth universally acknowledged, with apologies to Jane Austen, that diversity and inclusion is good for business. But how about adopting business adopting diversity and inclusion as an active strategy, just a better strategy for business? So that's one idea that I want to get out. The other idea that I want to get out here is the concept right now is all about sustainability and stakeholders for an inclusive capitalism. That's the theme of WEF 2020. How does inclusion and diversity factor into that conversation on sustainability? So the first question, and I'm going to address this to you, Dame Vivian, because you are in many ways the leader of all the studies that have come in this particular area, and also to you, Sarah Kate, and to Christiana. Why are diversity and inclusion important for businesses? Why should the private sector care about inclusion? Dame Vivian?
Well, the evidence base about the positive business impact for more inclusive management teams is in. It's not a debate any longer. It's very clear over multiple studies, not only that McKinsey has done, but Facebook's data set. It is very clear that it's very strongly correlated with performance. And if anything, our latest research, which we'll be launching in March of this year, suggests an even higher performance differential between top quartile firms, so high-performing firms, which are all structurally more diverse than bottom quartile performing firms. And that gap, when we first published the work, just on gender alone, was 15%. The research we'll publish in March shows a 24% performance differential between firms in the top quartile and those in the bottom quartile. And every single high performer has more diverse business objectives, and that includes diversity and inclusion on their management team decision making. So we don't think it's an if, it is a how for most businesses. Secondly, different from Davos 5 years ago, 80% of businesses say that diversity and inclusion is a priority for them. But we also see a gap. Many companies have stalled on gender. They've stalled on cultural and ethnic diversity. They haven't defined diversity wide enough. And so We know it matters to performance, but not enough companies are building it in systematically.
But it's interesting you say that because it's often the case that a proposition is true, but it's not always the case that the opposite is also true. So this idea that actually if you're not diverse and inclusive, you don't do as well as businesses that are diverse and inclusive.
And the data set does demonstrate that quite strongly as well, that bottom quartile firms not only perform worse, that gap is getting bigger. So the simple point is more value and higher performance is accruing to companies that are more diverse. Similarly, those that haven't chosen to both either increase their participation rates or their inclusive practices are also falling further behind. And I think the real issue for business leaders at a place like Davos is now, what are we going to do about it?
So Sarah Kate, what about you? From the civil society sector, from the nonprofit sector, from where you sit, why should businesses care about what you do?
I don't think they have a choice, actually, because if you look at the next generation, the 18 to 34-year-olds, and how big of a priority this is for them, and how they judge the companies that they buy from and that they go work for through this lens, you will be put out of business over time. You will become a dinosaur. So this is a have to, and there's an urgency that's coming now because of this younger population, because they're entering the workforce, because they're starting to have disposable income, and they're becoming purchase decision makers. And so I think that when we start to look for the LGBTQ community specifically, we're seeing higher and higher instances of people identifying as LGBTQ plus in the 18 to 34-year-old demographic. And so they're going to be looking at companies and saying, are they diverse and inclusive? Do they really mean that? And there are ways to check that. And then they're going to say, what are they doing to advance my freedoms, my equality, my acceptance outside of internal company values? So I think you have to look at those as well. So not only is it get your own house in order, make sure that you have the policies and looking through everything through an HR lens, but then you have to think, how are you working and operating in the public sphere? And that's a big part of the conversation that we're having here in Davos right now is how are you operating in the public sphere? Because that not only does that attract new customers, and we have the data to prove that, but that also attracts new employees, and it pushes and moves equality forward for marginalized communities. How powerful is that? That you not only get to do good, you get to profit off of it too. It's a win-win, and I think one of the things that we're saying here in Davos is you now have a permission slip.
Yes.
And we have the empirical data to back that up. We'll be releasing that tomorrow. And to say, go do this. You're safe. This is safe, and they expect it. And now you're going to be judged if you don't do it. So its timing is becoming urgent now.
So speaking about that permission slip, then let's look at Deutsche Bank, because Christiana, you at Deutsche Bank have very publicly stated your goals, your inclusion agenda, and you've put yourselves very, very publicly behind it. What led to that decision making?
Well, it's very much what my fellow panelists were talking about, and some of the data that Vivian was putting behind it in terms of this increasing performance gap doesn't surprise me at all, because we look at it from the perspective of our clients and customers, just how important of a market that is for us, not only directly the purchasing power of the LGBT community itself, which is a $4 billion market in and of itself, but the ally community, and the fact that 85% of allies indicate that it is a really critical part of their purchasing decision as to who they're going to be engaging with. So we really looked at it as from the perspective of a business imperative. It's certainly the right thing to do, but it's also economically the right choice for us.
And so that's interesting, because you talk about allyship, and one of the ideas that I want to tease out of this conversation is that all the minority communities, we all need to be allies to each other as well. Right. And so it's not a zero-sum game. We can't just talk about racial equality and say, actually, that's something that is completely separate or isolated from gender diversity, because again, all of these issues are correlated, and oftentimes, moving the needle forward on one will move the needle forward on everything else, because it changes the way people think. So, sticking with you then Christiana, how do corporations adopt inclusion as a strategy in their business model? You know, we've understood, we've proven the proposition, we've taken the permission slip. In fact, we've said we're going to do it, but how?
So, as I said, first and foremost, you have to understand the economic rationale behind it, and I think we've clearly done that and articulated articulated it, but then you've got to also go the next step of really living the values and incorporating it into your business practices. And one of the most important visible steps that we've taken in the past couple of years has really been looking at who we choose to do business with.
Yes.
From a client perspective, but also from a supplier perspective, right? We all can't ignore just what an important purchasing power we have vis-a-vis all of our own vendors. And we took a pretty visible stand with a couple of our vendors, notably the Dorchester collection last year, in response to the very challenging human rights issues that we were seeing in the Sultanate of Brunei, and sent a signal not only to our suppliers externally, but really more importantly also to our staff internally. Like, we really care about this, and this really makes a difference. So I think living those values in a very visible way is an important part of making sure that what you express in commitments in terms of targets, as you say, is also really lived in the way we do business.
Vivian, what about the study? What does that show? What is your view in terms of living the values that you commit to?
Well, you have to get specific and make it very tangible inside the business. You know, we are very evidence-based in how we think about why this is important, but you have to make that specific so that it drives competitive advantage at Deutsche or at Facebook or at Dow, and that's going to be specific. And the reality is you might make different choices than a competitor, even within the same sector. So for example, how do you define diversity? We're talking about a range of intrinsic characteristics. I happen to be born a woman. I happen to be African American by birth, British by choice. I happen to have a certain education, but I also might gain a set of skills. I might live in a set of countries. I might choose to associate with a group of people. I might partner with different organizations or different teams. And so how you even define diversity, what does multivariate diversity mean for competitive advantage for your company, is the first thing. Why does it add value? And then strategies that are specific to your customer base, to your supply chain and your partnerships, specific to your investor mix. Those are going to be different choices, and that's why you see differential performance. Different companies are making different choices, and we think that's going to drive different performance outcomes. So the good news is those that are more diverse and manage it well with inclusive practices are the winners, for sure. But companies have to make those choices. How do we even define diversity for competitive advantage and cognitive and performance outcomes? Are we actually reflecting that in 2 or 3 areas of our business that you can see from space? 90% of CEOs and chairs say it's important. Only 50% of managers believe that their company is serious about it. Same company. Yeah. So you have to drive it quite deeply in the organization. It's very interesting when you hear Unilever or Johnson & Johnson speak and they say we're about 50% of the way there, because it's got to be quite deep in the culture of the company.
And so what you're saying is, of course, there is a gap between those that perform on inclusion and those that don't, and those who don't are going to lag behind. But in order to be able to harness that competitive advantage, you've got to really think about your business model, and you've got to embed this all the way through your business chain so that you make sure that you are delivering on diversity in the correct way. And then then it's all win-win. Nicola, turning to you, I know that Facebook, for example, has said that in the next 5 years, you want 50% of your workforce to be fully diverse or come from some sort of minority background. So I was hoping that you would give us some ideas and some examples of how at Facebook, why you thought diversity and inclusion was so important and how you've gone about implementing that.
Okay, so I think we're in agreement here based on all the evidence that we see in Vivian's report every year, we all wait and look forward to. They do better, the winners. That's what you said, that's the language. So the challenge then is, well, if we all know this, why isn't everybody doing it? And the answer is because it is hard. And it takes an absolute focus and it takes an investment. And for us, it started about 5-6 years ago, where we're a data company. That's what we do, engineering. We look at numbers. That's at the heart of everything we do. So we thought, let's count. Let's actually start with where we are today and what the landscape looks like. And let's publish every year and see how we're doing. Now, the good news is we are doing better. So we've gone from, in 2014, to having, if I take women, 31% of the company was women. Now it's 37%. We're not satisfied. As you say, we've got the goal that we're working towards by 2024. But across all the measures that we're looking at, we have increased, but we're not satisfied. So what are some of the things that we're doing? And you have to do different things for different populations as well. So for our senior leaders, we have a course called Managing Bias. We're virtually at 100% on that. We have something on managing inclusion that is much broader. We have something that called Be the Allies, where we've created ally circles. We've got 8,000 people in that. So that's something that goes all the way through the organization. It's about how we think about recruitment, having a diverse slate approach to recruitment, making sure we're always filling the roles with the right brilliant people, but making sure when you're starting the funnel at the top that you're embracing diversity, or you're never going to see the change that you want to see. Within the organization, within the company, we have employee resource groups that we fund and we help. So, for example, we have a Women Act group, we have a Black Act group, we have a Differently Able group, and many others, veterans in the US. And we brought together, in the EMEA region, we brought together 2,000 women just at the back end of last year to come together, to share, to learn, to be inspired by one another, to see the relatable role models in different parts of the organization. So many things that I think are important, but ultimately, it's a good thing to do, not just because it's the right thing to do, which matters, but also it's good for the business as well. And for a company like Facebook, we have to have the people inside the company being reflective of the people around the world that are using our products to make sure we're really understanding what everybody needs.
And so, staying with you for a moment, Nicola, then, and I'm going to put this question to you and to Jim and to Sarah Kate. The next question then is, well, your users are diverse and your employees are diverse, your supply chain is diverse, and so you've got to be able to be responsive and reactive to the demands of all of those there, because diverse people, you need to include people who are diverse. They're your employees, as I said, supply chain, stakeholders, investors. They're also the people that you answer to. But the question is, how does diversity and inclusion as an active strategy within a business impact the wider community in which it operates?
Well, I think it makes a very big difference because if I even think about the products that we have, well, think about if you're a blind or partially sighted person, how to use Facebook. Mm-hmm. That's a challenge, right? So we actually have a whole team internally headed up by a blind engineer called Matt King, who actually, through the use of artificial intelligence, through machine learning, that they can see pictures by being described what's in the image. Now, that wasn't possible 5 years ago. The technology wasn't there to make that possible. But now it can say, well, it looks like a few people are having a conversation. I'm not sure what they're having a conversation. She's looking animated. And so we can start to extract out from that. So I think that's one example that then you can bring people in, that you can then change the nature of the conversation. You can give voice to different communities. And when you start to do that, then I think you get to greater creativity, greater innovation, greater connection, and that can go into so many different places.
And data and tech actually, in a way, are such important tools to increasing inclusion. I mean, there's always that joke that I make, but it's absolutely true, is, when you have those automatic soap dispensers and they don't recognize you because they've been designed by white people for white people. Yeah. But the answer there is actually, if you're embedding that into your business, you are being able to provide a better service to your customers. And so the way you're thinking, again, I'm hoping that more businesses will pick that up. Jim, from your side of the chain, of course, sustainability is very important to Dow. Communities in which you operate are very important to Dow. And I know that you in particular are very, very keen on this agenda. How does Dow, being a more inclusive company, impact the communities in which it operates?
So I think a lot of people have a perception of what we do in business, but they maybe don't understand that 70% of everything we make goes into a consumer product that you use every day. So that's an extremely diverse audience, and our brand owners have these challenges as well. Mm-hmm. And when they come to us with scientific problems. They come to us with technical problems, and they need solutions. Mm-hmm. So when we meet them, if we look like a homogenous society and we don't reflect the world that they work in, they get a limited viewpoint in terms of how we solve a problem. We do some work internally with a group called the Medici Group about building inclusion into teams. And one of the principles I'll talk about is if you take a pretty homogenous group and you put one diverse member in the team, maybe that diverse member gets a voice in, but a lot of times they get shut out by the rest of the team. Until you really bring in 2, 3, 4, half the team being diverse members, you really don't start to see any diversity of thought. And if you're trying to innovate and you're trying to create new solutions or new products, you need a lot of diversity of thought at the table. It doesn't matter if it's a new product for a consumer brand company or it's addressing a sustainability challenge like plastic waste. Mm-hmm. You got to be able to think about these things differently, and you got to be able to tackle them. And it's also about engagement. And to Sarah Kate's point earlier, yeah, we try to hire, and we want to hire the best and the brightest, but they have to want to come to a place where they feel like they're going to be included and going to be engaged in the conversation, and they can make a difference. And if they feel that way, you're going to do a better job of hiring the best, and that's going to build on itself. So I agree with Dame Vivian. When you're winning, you keep winning, and others keep falling behind, and that's what creates that gap in those studies. A lot of times with our customers, they make decisions. They make a lot of decisions on why to buy from us. A lot of them are technical. Some of them are price. Some of them are how close are we to their facilities. At the end of the day, they have to decide they want to work with you or not. And they look at your team and they say, how do you treat each other? Are you winners? Do I want to work with you? Or do you look like a dinosaur? And you've got to reflect that in all of your business strategy.
And it's also the case, I mean, if you go to Midland, as I have done, you know, you see people
Right.
who have worked with Dow and for Dow for generations.
Many.
So again, talking about this idea of attracting the right talent, how do you make sure that you attract and you keep that talent there? Because they could go work elsewhere.
Midland, Michigan is 40,000 people, so we're a product of small towns. And when you look at our manufacturing facilities around the world, they're not mega cities, right? And so we have to attract people in those communities. But bigger, we have to be part of that community, and we have to help change the fabric of that community. Now, you know, historically, Dow was a very international company, and so we brought a lot of international diversity into a place like Midland. But maybe we didn't deal with ethnic diversity or gender diversity or LGBT diversity very well. Now you will see us out in the community actually having an active engagement on all of those issues. We do LGBT seminars, we do supplier diversity conferences, and it's amazing how many people from all walks of life will come out of that, and suddenly you realize they're dealing with all the same issues that we're dealing with. They're in government, they're in the school system, they're in the clergy, and they're dealing with the same challenges that we deal with. When we bring our experiences to that community, the whole community grows. That makes a difference when people come to town, because they look at a small town and they say, then they walk away and they say, this is nothing like what I expected. I expected to go to a small town and see that it was kind of, you know, lost in the 60s or 70s, and they come in here and say, this is a pretty multicultural place. You have to create that. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because you're engaged and you're being part of that community.
And the interesting thing there is that, you know, you're thinking, and the idea that's coming out of this panel is, you know, the opportunity cost. And imagine everything you're losing out on as a business if you aren't being diverse and inclusive, or if you're not building those sustainable communities. Sarah Kate, question to you then. I know that you work very closely with advertising, with Hollywood, to make sure that there are inclusive storylines in films, that advertising represents the customers that it's supposed to be reaching out to. How does that inclusivity within the business sphere impact the wider community?
Oh, I think, you know, business, so at GLAAD, we used to look just at Hollywood and news and journalism because they were the cultural curators of the world, honestly. What came out of Hollywood was a one-way street. But now businesses are their own platforms, right? And CEOs are celebrities now. The world has changed dramatically because of social media and digital. And I think that we've found, especially in North America, especially around LGBTQ issues, we need big business to move acceptance forward. And so there have been specific things. Marriage equality is one of them. An amicus brief signed by hundreds and hundreds of businesses saying that we want this. We're dealing with Tennessee right now in the United States, where 5 bad bills are up, and we're calling on business to stand up against this because they have the economic power to move policy. And I think internationally, a lot of the conversation that happens here in Davos is about the 70 countries where it's still criminalized to be LGBTQ, and how are businesses building a coalition around that? Because not one business can do it, right? And that's a big step, is to, you know, businesses have a dance that they're doing internationally, globally, if you will, where, especially around LGBTQ, women's issues, other women's issues, and so they need support too in order to move policy forward, and they need to rely on each other and come together around those issues, along with NGOs like myself, in order to move the needle. But business has a unique and powerful ability to move policy and acceptance forward for all marginalized communities globally, and they're accessing that power now. And I think for us as, for myself as a leader in the LGBTQ community, it is so inspiring and exciting because we can move so much faster and we can see a lot more progress in a shorter period of time.
And it's interesting because when you say businesses have such a lot of power, and in a way what's coming out again of this panel is actually they're also doing it for themselves, and they've got to do it for themselves. They've got to use that power. Within the media industry, again, on LGBTQ, you've been behind some very, very successful movements to help change policy, help change what's happening on the ground, and actually help change people's lives. Do you have any experiences to share in particular on that front?
I think if I hearken to a very recent experience in the United States, there was this kerfuffle in December around the Hallmark Channel, which is beamed into 58 million households in America. And basically, the short story is that there was an ad, Zola, which is a wedding planning company ad, had two women, it had a same-sex wedding in it. And they pulled the ad because there was a very small amount of people that signed a petition. I think it was 25,000 people from an anti-LGBTQ group. They didn't realize who was behind this petition, and they pulled the ad. And the response from the community was swift and dramatic. It rose right to the top of the news stories, and it became a real topic. Now, imagine you're Hallmark. A lot of policies, and in-house, they have a lot pulled together. They're not ill-meaning in this position. They are ill-informed, and I always say, please call me before you do anything like this. But they didn't, and they didn't realize, and they pulled the ad, and now they're in the holiday season, their busiest season of the year, and they've got a major controversy that's escalating minute by minute. And so what we do is we go in and we have a conversation with them, and we talk to them about how, first and foremost, they need to be willing, and they need to value diversity and inclusion, and they do. And then we take them through the steps of sort of crisis managing that moment, but then more for the future, it's how can you not get back in this position? So we prefer to be there at the beginning. We work with multinational Fortune 500 companies all the time, and we help them get their policies in place internally, but also externally. How are they going to position themselves? And so when a moment like that happens, this group has gone up against Disney, Procter & Gamble, Kellogg's, and they all called us first because they had us on speed dial. And so I always say, put me on your speed dial, please, if you're running one of these companies before you do anything. But that's one. And for me, it was very personal. My wife and I have twin 10-year-olds. This was happening over a weekend. And my kids were seeing this happen. And literally, the couple looked like my wife and I in our wedding photo. And my kids are trying to understand, why are they rejecting our family? Like, why we're different? These are concepts to kids where they're realizing, oh, we're not like the rest. And so it was really personal for me to fix this so that I can give a happy ending to the story to my kids, and Christmas could go on.
So you saved Christmas, basically.
I saved Christmas.
The lesson from that, I suppose, is, cold circuit. But I mean, that's actually quite serious, because I think one of the things that we're talking about is businesses. How do they embed inclusion into their culture? Well, actually, you've got to work with civil society in order to be able to do it. And people talk about the market, and again in Hollywood, my own anecdote that I'll give you is 15 years ago, I wanted to go into film and television and theater, and an agent said to me, oh, great, this was 15 years ago, there'll be lots of roles for you to play the terrorist, the IT guy, the taxi driver, the medic, and I thought, maybe not. But now, You know, people are shocked that Black Panther did so well. People are completely shocked that Crazy Rich Asians was one of the biggest hits of the box office. Well, of course it is. So you've got to do it, and you've got to work with civil society in order to do that. I want to flip the conversation then from that to you, Christiana, and again back to you, Jim, to talk about sustainability, because that's something that is a big theme over here in Davos in 2020. It has been for a while, but now we're really talking about it. Larry Fink's letter that came out a week ago talks about this idea of a longer-term horizon and stakeholders demanding it. There's a lot of conversation about ESG. But ESG is not just a nice to have. If the answer is that actually diversity and inclusion is going to make you a better performing business, then actually ESG needs to be part of your KPIs. It needs to be part of your business plan. And so from an investor and stakeholder perspective, talking about lack of inclusion, lack of sustainability often impacts the people who are less included within society most. So how do you address that? How do you address the voice of your stakeholders? And how do you engage with your stakeholders to say, you know what, inclusion is actually a part of sustainability?
So I think a lot of this comes back to the topic we were talking about before in terms of measurement, right? And this has been a big topic here in Davos for the past couple of days, trying to pin down how are we. Larry Fink's provocation to the industry was fantastic last week, but it set off a flurry of discussion on how do we actually measure what we're talking about here and the level of commitment to the sustainability agenda. We had an interesting discussion at the Deutsche Bank Lounge yesterday around measuring, looking for new metrics to measure economic development, right? We get so myopically focused just on your gross domestic product and growth, and is that perhaps driving the wrong behavior if we're not looking at something that's more broad and reflects not just the economic growth, but the sustainability of that economic growth in terms of wealth distribution, in terms of inclusion in the economy. So very interesting conversations going on around that. Bringing that to the micro level for firms, it's around us in the business world, internalizing that conversation on measurement, figuring out how are we going to be putting out the right targets, how are we holding ourselves accountable, how do we allow our stakeholders, our investors, for banks in particular, our regulators, policymakers, give them the opportunity as well to measure our progress on that front. Right now, it really does feel like a jumble, and I can talk about it a bit from the perspective of a leading global financial organization, and we look at advising our corporate issuers in particular on the ESG aspects of their engagement with investors, and we're really lacking that common standard. You can take a specific slice of an industry, and the top 4 players in that industry will end up in different places, in 4 different places in 4 different rankings, right? And that just can't be, because we're not offering our stakeholders at large the right way and the right opportunity to hold us accountable and measure it.
Well, it's also about risk, because if you're not factoring in sustainability or lack thereof, inclusion or lack thereof into your model and into your thinking, then the call that you're taking on risk and on long-term risk is probably going to be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage people. We put out a kind of a teaser research report prior to the forum this week, which looked at some hard statistics behind that in terms of the performance, again, of equities on the greener, more sustainable side of the spectrum versus those on the opposite. And it really does go right into that question of performance, risk-adjusted performance, right? In the long term, you're seeing far better performance of firms who are really incorporating the sustainability and agenda into what they do.
And again, if firms are incorporating inclusion into their business model, then actually they're also addressing the sustainability gap, because inclusion is part of that. And also, again, you're going to be offering better solutions, because as a team, you're going to think better about how you solve those problems. So moving on from that then, off the back of that, Jim, again, Dow is a company where you've said very publicly that sustainability is really important to you, and that you want to make Dow one of the most sustainable, long-term thinking companies out there. So again, why should inclusion matter in the context of sustainability?
So we had a chance last year to relaunch Dow as we spun it out of the Dow-DuPont merger. And one of the things that we did historically, our mission, vision, values, our purpose, if you will, would have always been to be the largest and most profitable chemical company in the world. And a lot of companies would have that. And I would say that's the that's the lead into maybe the old version of capitalism is dead. Because it was shareholder primacy and it was everything else will work itself out. You know, everything else will be right. So we relaunched and we created you could call it a purpose. I called it an ambition because we're not there yet. But our ambition was to be the most innovative, customer-centric, inclusive, and sustainable material science company in the world. And everybody says, well, why those four? And I'm like, well, they're all interrelated. I can't be the most innovative if I'm not inclusive and customer-centric, right? And most of my innovations, 8 or 9 out of 10 projects that we're working on have a sustainability element to them. So it is one of the biggest technical challenges that we have in front of us, especially if you're in an industry that uses a lot of energy, uses fossil fuels, doesn't burn it all, but we use it actually to make materials. So some of these materials are not burned fossil fuels, so they're going to be with us for a while. So those things are under attack, and you've got to be able to address these issues. And that has to be core to what we do. And I think to get to Dame Vivian's point, you've got to change that strategy, but then you've got to work it through the organization. So inclusion, the reason we focused on inclusion and not diversity is we had years and years of looking at numbers and hiring and trying to move the needle, and we'd plateaued at our ability to get more women in the workplace, more ethnic minorities, people with disabilities. When you move to inclusion, this goes to behavior changes. You've got to get people managers and supervisors have to learn how to put together inclusive teams. They have to learn how to make people feel like they are part of the team and they're really truly included, not just because of the way they look or who they are, but for their thoughts and their inputs and their ideas. You can hire diversity, but then if you shut them out of the team discussion, you're not going to get productivity or you're not going to get anything out of them. And so if you move to inclusion, I think it's a higher calling, and that's the way we've looked at it. And if you're going to get inclusion in the organization, you have to have trust. You have to have trust with people to get their engagement, and you have to learn about what motivates them. That is a big difference in the strategy. If you do that well within your company, then you're going to do that well outside the company. You take care of your employees, they're going to take care of your customers. At the bottom line, happy employees, happy customers is really, if you boil it down to the two simplest parts of this strategy, that's what you need.
That's really interesting because it is about adjusting in a way the horizon using which you look at your business and you look at your bottom line and you look at what makes you a successful business and how you address that in the longer term. Because one of the ideas again that I want us to think about is the fact that actually if businesses are able to use, we talked about impact that businesses have on community, and we talked about the fact that businesses that are more inclusive do better. Now, if you are able to impact your community, you are going to do better, and it's going to come back to you exponentially because it means that all of the people who are being left out are not going to be left out. They're going to be part of your supply chain. They're going to be part of your employees. They're going to be your investors. So one of the things, Jim, you said is very interesting because you said you can't just hire in and then leave them there. You have to create a system that responds to the characteristics and the talents of the people that you hired. And I want us to think a little bit, this is the last 7 minutes of the panel, of this concept of equality versus equity. Because a lot of people say equality. Well, equality means treating everyone in the same way, whereas equity, in a way, means giving people what they individually need in order to succeed. Right. And, you know, you might have something different, I might have something different, all of us have something different. And so it's creating that environment where that individual talent can thrive because of their individual characteristics. But also to flip the conversation, the last question, and I was going to address it only to 3 people on the panel, but I'm going to go round the panel, is something slightly more philosophical, and this idea of capitalism. So at the moment, we were talking before the panel started about the Edelman Trust Barometer, and last year it said that the majority of people in the world feel that the system isn't working for them, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the kind of protests and the populism and the hate and the division that we see in society. So if the system isn't working for them, and this year's Edelman Barometer says that there's a lot of people aren't very convinced with capitalism as a system. There's a lot of suspicion of it. Well, so it feels almost like capitalism itself is at an inflection point. It needs to change in order to survive? And maybe the answer is a more inclusive capitalism.
Right.
So it's not as if capitalism is the problem. Capitalism, in fact, could be the solution, but it's the solution if it changes the model and it changes the way it behaves. So that's the question that I want to throw out to this panel, this idea of profit versus purpose that Nicholas started us off with. Do we need to rethink the way capitalism thinks? Because if we do, could it be the solution? Sarah Kate, can I start with you?
I would say absolutely. I think with anything, as we become smarter, as there's more competition, as we need to differentiate ourselves even more, we all have to evolve. Capitalism has to too. And I think the idea of stakeholder versus shareholder is fascinating. And it really struck me as looking at the different groups that your business affects, not just the bottom line, right? And it seems obvious at a level, but it's not the practice that we've been doing. And so, but we've been talking the talk. And so I think that putting metrics against how we're measuring stakeholder involvement and how we're going to deliver against that is the critical question here.
I think last year when we, in the U.S., when we signed the Business Roundtable letter about stakeholder engagement, there was a lot of noise, and we would get a lot of questions about, well, that means the shareholder is not important anymore. And we didn't say that. We said we had to find a way to both deliver financial results and address social issues, ESG issues, to be able to do the right thing for everybody. Because the current form of capitalism was leaving a lot of people behind. It was creating inequities. It was creating pay gaps. We weren't creating jobs. Everybody had to have a college degree to go into business, which isn't true. So we were creating a lot of things in the system that needed to be fixed. That doesn't mean that socialism is the answer, because I think there's a lot of things about our way of life and our freedoms that we would not like under that system. But capitalism's got to move. And so inclusive capitalism a few years ago was the term that was coined. And I think when you hear Mark Benioff say here on the stage that he believes that capitalism is dead, I think what he's saying is capitalism's got to move. Old capitalism is dead, and it's got to move into this different space. And business has that ability to make that move happen. If you get a time like we're in right now, where in some place in the EU a little bit, in the United States, in China, it feels like everybody's going back into their corners and going to be self-reliant. Business has got to step in, because we're not going to succeed without global trade and allies and partners around the world. So business now has a foot in every camp and has to come out and say, let's pull this together. Well, I think the same is true for all the stakeholders that we do business with. We've got a foot in every camp. That community doesn't succeed, we don't succeed. If we don't create jobs for the high school graduates, then we're going to have pay gap and we're going to have other problems. If we don't create opportunities for women, we're going to have problems. If we don't address the plastic waste issue, we're going to be out of business. That's how we've got to think about it.
And it's interesting you say that, because again, there is a growing sense, not a growing sense, it's actually, again, something that everyone's talking about, is this idea that there is declining trust in public institutions. And so actually businesses need to step into that breach. They need to be able to address that gap, that lack of trust. And again, that doesn't come from adopting a radically different form of operation. It comes from refining and fine-tuning and realizing that actually stakeholder and shareholder is not all that different. Or this idea of saying, well, are you not putting profit first? Well, actually, you are putting profit first, because that's why you're talking about trying to make a sustainable pipeline of profit. Right. And also that's why you're talking about inclusion, because you want to be able to solve problems better.
Krishna, can I jump the queue and respond to what Jim said? Because it was actually very interesting that you mentioned the Business Roundtable announcement from August. So just in August, was just relocating back to the United States after about 20 years over in Europe. And I'll tell you, many of us in Europe at that point in time were kind of scratching our heads like, why is this so revolutionary? This is in many ways, the way social market capitalism has operated in many European economies since kind of the post-World War II era, right? And provocatively, you could argue, is that responsible for some of the slower growth rates in Europe, et cetera? But ultimately, socially, we think it's the right direction to go. So it was interesting to see that from the other side of the ocean. I'll take the rest of my time to make one observation that I do think a new form of capitalism has a very important role to play in addressing the E part of the ESG debate, in particular, using the capitalist system to drive through the price of carbon, getting that right equilibrium on driving to carbon neutrality in the foreseeable future, right? If we can use capitalist market systems to put the right price tag on that and allow also, the CFOs of the world's largest companies to stand in front of their investors and say, you know what, I had to take that investment decision because look, the price of carbon was driving me to invest in an alternative outlook. We're giving everybody kind of the opportunity to really make the right economic decision. So I do think, while the proclamation that capitalism is dead is perhaps over-exaggerated, the new form of capitalism is a really important tool for us to be driving towards some of our sustainability goals.
Dame Vivian.
I'll go next, and we'll allow Nicola, our host, the last word. We are describing it in McKinsey's advice to companies and leaders as a modern 21st century corporation. You can spend a lot of time looking back. What did we do wrong yesterday? What things would we have changed, et cetera, et cetera. Investors, our employees, our children, they're all in the future. Yes. And there's an urgency just to look forward. What can we do? What better decisions can we make going forward? And in the 21st century modern corporation, businesses and leaders have the opportunity to make better decisions. And they can add additional metrics with technology, which is a red thread enabling the data, the decision-making, the collaboration, the problem-solving, the solutions that allow us to solve these problems in ways that we couldn't before. In the same way in financial services, countries in lower economic development are leapfrogging whole steps in the value chain of energy, leapfrogging steps in financial inclusion, leapfrogging steps in data access and collaboration. None of us would build our supply chains. None of us would even be educated the way we were even one generation ago. And so we really believe, one, that overall it is a time for investment and growth worldwide. Many, many people can still have their lives improved and be lifted out of poverty. It may be slower growth in the developed world, faster growth in the emerging markets, but actually that's probably fair and reasonable because we can globally participate in it because of technology, data transparency. Two is leaders have to be bigger and broader. We need more mature, more integrative, more sophisticated leaders who can deal with 3 or 4 goals. If you give any of us one target, we'll over-focus on it. But if you try and balance 4 or 5 things the way you described, it's a harder job.
Yes.
That's why only some companies are successful over the long term. Yeah. But the ones that are able to manage it, we think will win in the end.
And the answer to the takeaway for leaders is actually, if you do this, it's going to make you look better. So do it, because you're going to deliver better results.
And we have to be servant leaders,
yes.
Not just flashy leaders.
Yes.
I don't really agree with the idea of leaders and CEOs as celebrities and personalities. They're more visible, they have better tools and communication, and they have higher accountability to multiple audiences. That doesn't make you a celebrity. That makes you more visible in the commitments that you make. And if we can help leaders not feel like they're taking big risks, but rather they're delivering to those multiple stakeholders, we're all going to be better off.
And it goes back to the point that you made about trust. Nicola, last word. 1 minute to go.
Okay, so I kicked it off, so you knew my answer to this question anyway, which is I absolutely believe in profit and purpose. I think the two sit well together. But I actually think if you're a leader today and you want to have a workforce of the future, you absolutely have to embrace these questions. Because young people today, and being a mom of 4, I've got my own focus group at home that tell me this constantly. They're not too happy with how they see the world at the moment. And the sorts of I've got children now coming into the workforce. They're really looking at a company's values and not just what they say, but actually what they do. And if they're going to actually go and work for that company, they really want to see the to-do part. So that would be my kind of way of bring it back down to the people. Because ultimately, whether it's the people that work for you or the people that are your customers, they're going to care, and they already do care. So if you're not there, we'll go back to the reports that Vivian will keep producing every March that will tell us that the gap between the highest performing companies that are diverse, that are inclusive, that do care about the things that are going on in the world, they're the ones that will continue to pull further away from those that don't.
I think that's a very powerful message, because ultimately we are all in the business of people. It's often forgotten, but we are all in the business of people, and so if you care about the people, you've got to do this. So thank you for that. I can safely say that as a result of this conversation, the rumors of capitalism's death have been greatly exaggerated. Thank you to everyone who's been watching online and to those of us who are going to be watching later in the day in the US. Thank you again for joining, and thank you all for giving us your time during WEF, and it's now back out into the snow.
Well, thank you.
Thanks,
Christian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.